what's going on? Like I said,
Yeah, obviously Nepal has a lot of regional connections within that geographic region of South Asia, particularly close relationships with India. The Indian government has provided substantial urban search and rescue capabilities, as well as a lot of logistical capabilities in terms of rotary assets and air assets, to trying to obviously get people to remote areas where the earthquake hit, but also to make sure they can get supplies out to those areas and the urban search and rescue teams. In addition to India, China's provided support and assistance as well. Israel also has an urban search and rescue team that has come all the way from Israel to Nepal. This is a global response. Japan has a very strong urban search and rescue component. They have as well sent a team in. The British government, the Australian government had provided humanitarian assistance through funding mechanisms to NGOs and UN partners. So while obviously it's a regional response, and those countries such as India and China, who are the closest to Nepal, are able to respond the quickest and have a significant presence there, it's a global response. Everybody understands the significance and the impact that's taking place in Nepal. And so there is funding going in, there is personnel going in, and there's urban search and rescue teams going in from a number of different countries. So it's important to understand that the U.S. government, we're not the only players taking part. We are one part coming in at the request of the host nation, Nepal. They need our assistance, and we are one and a part of many in the global community that's assisting in this. All right, so the moment the disaster takes place, we have our urban search and rescue components that have a partnership with USAID OFTA based out of Fairfax County in Virginia and LA County in California. We immediately mobilized both components of our urban search and rescue teams. Within 6 hours, we had them ready to deploy. And those are large teams. To give you an idea of scale and scope, that's 137 people, that's 12 search and rescue dogs, that's all of the equipment that they're going to need. So we're talking heavy-duty equipment that needs to be loaded, put onto either DoD or commercial assets. In this case, it was C-17s. They were able to load up with all of their equipment, whether that's rock cutting equipment, whether that's large moving equipment, and flown in on a moment's notice, as well as our entire disaster assistance response team. So you're talking about humanitarian experts that have been working in disaster response for decades. Many of them have been a part of earthquakes globally, whether that's Pakistan, Haiti, tsunamis that took place in Japan as well as Indonesia. We're also sending technical experts in water and sanitation, health and nutrition, food, commodities and livelihoods, shelter and settlement. So this is a large group of experts in the field that we're able to mobilize within 6 hours to send out to respond. So it's important when you're thinking about what our response looks like is to understand how multifaceted it is. Obviously in an earthquake, the main priority is that urban search and rescue component. Those are the people that minutes matter, hours matter, and they're saving lives for people who are underneath the rubble. But after that, there's a lot of other response that also impacts human life and the suffering of the people on the ground. So then we're looking at those other technical components of making sure shelter's provided, making sure they have access to clean drinking water, and ensuring that their medical needs are met. And that's going to be a long-term process that we're working with. So it's a multifaceted response. It's something that comes together very quickly, but it comes together from a lot of different components and a lot of different parts of the United States. So the next few days, the main priority obviously is going to be that urban search and rescue component, and that's where we're putting a lot of our resources, both in coordinating with other components on the ground, whether that's other countries or host nation components. We're making sure that we're coordinating, prioritizing areas where we think there's the largest likelihood to be able to find survivors. As the hours go by, that becomes less and less likely, so we want to prioritize those key areas where there's large populations impacted by the quake, where there's a chance of pulling survivors out of the rubble. So that's going to be our main priority. And that's going to be a whole unity of effort from USAID OFTA standpoint, from the U.S. military standpoint. We are all coordinating all of our logistical capabilities to get them to the places they need to be to make sure that they can hopefully find survivors. Now, following on to that, we're going to start looking at other needs because those needs are going to shift. The reality is that on the ground, unfortunately, after a certain window, which our experts will they'll work with the host government to decide what that is, search and rescue efforts start to become less and less relevant because unfortunately there probably aren't any more survivors. Then we're looking at the people who have survived and trying to meet those immediate needs. You have to understand that most of these people have lost their homes. And within that, they've lost all of their abilities for livelihoods. They've lost their abilities to cook for themselves, to clothe and feed their children, basic dignity, abilities to bathe and to have a good hot meal. A lot of those things are gone for large numbers of people. So we're looking at addressing those types of immediate needs. Many of these communities are really cut off. You probably already understand, but Nepal, obviously, Kathmandu and a lot of the villages that are affected are in a valley. But it's a very mountainous region, and so some of these communities that are outside of the valley, when the earthquake happens, they're cut off. So they don't have access to the types of livelihood activities and the other basic food commodities that they need for survival. So we're going to be looking at accessing those very remote communities that need the assistance the most. So the major priority right now is going to be getting them shelter. There's a lot of people living outside of either crushed buildings or buildings that could collapse. We want to make sure that people aren't driven back inside because they don't have shelter. Because you could have aftershocks or just poor construction that can fall later, and we don't want deaths to take place later because we didn't provide them the assistance they need. So that's going to be the first priority, is getting those people shelter. Then we're going to look at providing wash and sanitation needs, because that's going to also prevent disease as well as just meeting that basic need of needing water. And then we're also going to be treating medical. There are trauma units on the ground. Those aren't with USAID OFTA, but we are certainly supporting partners that are dealing with medical trauma on the ground and meeting those medical needs of the people on the ground. So those are the priorities that we're going to be looking at over the next probably 3 to 7 day period, and then we'll continue to reevaluate and assess what those needs are and adjust what our response is accordingly. Yeah, so we're looking at a couple major things right now. The first one is, obviously there's a lot of assistance trying to go in and a lot of people trying to go out of the main international airport in Kathmandu. That creates a logistical nightmare on the ground. And it's causing delays for a number of humanitarian actors to get their personnel and their supplies in. So one of the first things that we're going to be doing is trying to work on providing some of that lift and apron management of the international airport so that we can get teams in and get teams out and offloaded in a reasonable amount of time and get that airport running at capacity, because it's just not able to run at capacity right now. And so that level of logistics and that type of management is something that is very much unique to DoD and something that we're going to depend on having things run smoothly, because we're going to be needing to get more and more supplies in. As those assessments get farther out to those deeper areas and more remote areas, we're going to need to get more and more supplies in, and that airport's going to need to function and function well. So that's going to be priority number one. Priority number two is going to be looking at getting lift of personnel and supplies out to these remote areas. First and foremost, that will be in the form of assessments, because we need to know exactly what those needs are on the ground. We don't want to pull anything from anywhere if it's not a priority need, because if we do that, it clogs up the pipeline for other people trying to bring in needed assistance. So we have to be very careful to identify exactly what those needs are on the ground. Once we do that, though, we recognize that most of the road and other infrastructures, they're not available now in Nepal. They've been damaged too severely by the earthquake, and so we're going to need to make sure that we have airlift to get those supplies. A lot of that will be plastic sheeting for shelter and settlements, but we'll also be looking at water and sanitation equipment for water purification, and then some dignity kits and other basic household items that we can be providing. And so we're going to need, likely, in all likelihood, some type of rotary wing assets. Obviously, we're going to leave that to our DoD colleagues to decide exactly what components are going to work best. But just given the nature and the lack of lack of runways and other access capabilities, will probably be some type of rotary wing that we'll be looking at to make sure to ferry people and cargo to those remote areas. So those are probably going to be the main two things. Now, I do want to emphasize that there's a lot of other air assets there. As we said before, India has a number of helicopters and personnel there. The United Nations has a number of air assets there. So we're going to work closely to coordinate with them to try to get an understanding of when they have full capacity and scope, so we can move our DoD assets out. Because we don't need them there if they've got other things to do. So we're going to be working really closely with the rest of the humanitarian community to identify the gaps where we can provide that unique capability. And then once that gap isn't there, we'll either move somewhere else or we'll pull everything out as quick as we can. We can let the international community and eventually the government in Nepal take over that role.
Correlated the use of the DoD assets. this timing piece is amazing. I was talking about it.
Yeah, obviously the timing is critical, particularly in an earthquake. When your urban search and rescue is such a critical component in a disaster such as an earthquake, when minutes and hours really can save lives. But it is an immense logistical operation to get the technical people, the amount of components, the amount of equipment involved in this type of an operation is astronomical. It is global. Currently on the DART, we have people that will be traveling in from Australia, from Thailand, from the US, from Pakistan, from Virginia, from California, from Okinawa. You have a lot of people doing a lot of different roles to get everybody there as fast as possible. And that's the only way that takes place is coordination and planning beforehand. And we've put a lot of effort into making sure that the timing issues don't slow us down, that we can move as fast as possible. Because in these type of instances, it's critical that we get there as quickly as we can, despite all the logistical challenges that we have and that we need to face. It's hard. Like, moving that many people and that much equipment in this amount of time is difficult, and it never runs smoothly. There will always be a problem. What the planning and the preparation allows us to do is overcome that problem and find solutions when it happens, because it's never going to run smoothly. So how do we fix the problem and how do we get past it? And that's where we are right now. And right now we have 2 USAR teams on the ground conducting urban search and rescue as we speak. And that is a testament to the fact that we're all ready to work together and be one government in order to respond in this capacity.
Awesome. That's really
so obviously in the Asia Pacific, OFT has had a long history working with the MEB. There's a lot of disaster response, and the MEB tends to be more one of the forward-leaning arms of the military in the PACOM AOR. So oftentimes when they deploy with the DART team. So those assessments are conducted jointly, so we can both have a strong understanding of exactly where those military needs are and what those unique capabilities are going to be. And that early tie-in really allows us to scope the mission very quickly, have a succinct understanding of what those needs are, bring the personnel in that's going to be required, but also to wrap up quickly when the time is there to hand over to the international community. And as long as we have that tie-in really, really early, which is something that we've established through obviously a number of responses, but also through training exercises, through doing joint humanitarian operation courses that OFTA puts on with the military, that allows us to have those strong tie-ins and linkages so that when these things happen, we can be a seamless machine and go out together. It's part of why I'm here in the role that I'm in, doing the civil assistance coordination, so that we have a linkage directly between the DART, focused on the humanitarian assistance component and their technical expertise, and with the U.S. military and the MEB, and the assistance that they can provide in those unique capabilities. That tie-in and that linkage is already there. It's embedded in it. And so that way we can work a lot easier. We know what each other needs, what each other can do, and hopefully it becomes a seamless transition from one to the other. The only other thing that I think we just want to emphasize is, we are really there to support the people of Nepal, but they're the first responders. They were there. They're the first ones that are pulling people out of the rubble. They're going to be there after we leave. So our role is really to find those gaps and those needs that they have, support them so that they can carry it on. Because they're really the ones who are inviting us into the country, but they're also the ones that need the assistance, but they also know what they need and they know how to get that job done. So working closely with the host government and with those communities there is always going to be probably the biggest piece of the puzzle that maybe we don't emphasize enough. But it's those people on the ground that are really going to drive how we operate. And that's why we're there to begin with. So I think it's just important for us as the USG, to constantly remember is our whole of government effort is really also reaching out to those communities on the ground, and we're following their lead and what they need. So I think that's kind of the big takeaway that we just want to always kind of remember as we go in with all of our resources and personnel. We're meeting the needs of those people on the ground.